I've been lurking here for a long time, and never really expected to post anything. After an experience I had earlier this week, however, I decided it'd be a good idea to post it here, while the details are still fresh in my mind. St. Patrick's Day is a crazy occasion in most cities, and my hometown of Dublin is no exception. Last week, I found myself with a few days off on either side of our national holiday, and so decided to get away from the madness of the city and spend some time camping and hiking in the nearby mountains. On the eve of my trip, my buddy called to tell me he was sick and couldn't join me on the adventure. Who needs him, I thought. I decided to make the trip alone. The weather was beautiful, and I spent a very enjoyable St. Patrick's Day hiking through the woods and mountains above Dublin, alongside a good number of similar-minded folks. At roughly 4 p.m., I noticed a nice thicket of trees in the distance, and made my way towards what looked like a perfect campsite. I found a clearing, set up my shelter, and prepared a delicious dinner before settling down with a book and the sounds of the wilderness for company. At 7 p.m., something changed. I suddenly became very uncomfortable and agitated. There was someone nearby. Somehow I just knew it. It was completely dark. I scanned the surrounding woods with my torch, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. It was just me and the trees. Settle down, I told myself. It's natural to feel a bit scared when you're alone in the woods. But no matter how much I tried to clear my mind, I couldn't shake the gut feeling that the situation just wasn't quite right. I knew that the last bus left the nearest village at 10:30 p.m., and that I was roughly 3 hours away by foot. In the heat of the moment, I decided to get the hell out of there and take my chances on the trail. I packed my gear in record time and moved out, stumbling over fallen trees and the thick gorse till I hit the trail. I was in a panic, but comforted by the well-trodden path. A half hour of gentle descent, and I'd be on a paved road, and after that it was only an hour to the well-frequented regional road that led to the village. After only a few hundred meters, however, I was stopped in my tracks. Sitting on a tree stump just off the side of the trail sat a lone figure. By the light of my headlamp, I saw that it was a man dressed in dark street clothes, rather than the bright hiking gear one might expect. I was instantly on edge. There was no point in trying to hide, as he had no doubt already seen me with my headlamp and reflective jacket. We drew closer in the darkness, and I saw that he was roughly in his 30s. As I passed, he looked at me, smiled, and said, "Lovely evening." "Yeah, it is." I said something like that anyway. It was probably more of a mumble. I continued forward, on my guard. After a minute or two, I turned to look behind me, and saw no sign of the man I had just passed. There was a house a kilometer or so in the distance, and I thought the best thing to do would be to stop there for directions to the village road. Several minutes later, I again felt a pang of uneasiness, and checked the path behind me, only to see the figure once again, this time on foot, heading the same direction as me. I hurried toward the house. I felt much more relaxed once I reached the warm glow of the cottage. I got directions from a nice elderly couple, and was pleased to learn the road was just a small distance away at the bottom of their driveway. With no sign of the mounted man behind me, I walked on. Just as I reached the road, I heard a banging noise from the direction of the house, followed by an out-of-breath yet familiar voice. "I've been separated from my friend. Did he come this way?" Without thinking, I scrambled up the embankment at the side of the road and concealed myself as best I could, one hand on my camping knife. My heart has never beat so fast. I couldn't hear the householder's reply, just the sound of the door closing, followed by footsteps on the gravel driveway. I saw the man, silhouetted by the moonlight, walk into the road and peer into the distance in either direction, before hurrying off in the opposite direction of the village. I waited in the hedgerow for I suppose 15 or 20 minutes, terrified, before plucking up the courage to continue my walk to civilization. I trudged on for over an hour before I heard the rumble of a car engine in the distance and saw its headlights approach. I stuck out my thumb, and to my surprise, the driver stopped. I asked if he could give me a ride into the village, and he said no problem. Once in the car, the driver, a friendly Polish man, asked if I was looking for my friend. A friend? No, I was out hiking alone and I just lost track of time. I lied, not wanting to admit I got scared camping alone. Oh, I only asked because I was just flagged down by another young man who told me he was looking for his friend, and you fit his description perfectly. He seemed very agitated. In shock, I told the driver about my encounter with the mountain man and how he had headed in the opposite direction over an hour ago. Well, he must have turned around because he stopped me only a few hundred meters behind the spot where I picked you up. 5 minutes later, I was back in the well-lit, well-populated village. I made it in time for the bus, and within the hour was back in Dublin city centre. I have no idea what was going on with that man, or what he intended to do if he caught up to me. I'm just glad I followed my gut, and was lucky enough to make it home with nothing more than an odd story. When I was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in southern Mississippi, about 1.5 hours west of Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field surrounded by woods. This house was about 5 miles from any paved road. To get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was south of the house. About a quarter-mile north from the house, he built a small lake, more like a pond. It was about as long as a football field, but a little wider. To get to the lake from the house, you could take Route A, which was a hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees. It was beautiful in the spring. Route B was about 100 yards east of Dogwood Lane, and we named it Vampire Trail because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun on the brightest days, and had a slight decline as you walked toward the lake. I say walked because this trail was not for vehicles. Thick woods filled the area outside and in between both trails. One morning during the fall, my parents and my little sister had gone to get ice cream and do some shopping. This trip would take them at least an hour or two. I was 10 years old, so I decided to go fishing while listening to Bama play Ole Miss. The game was the usual Bama win, so I thought I could ease the boredom of a blowout by fishing in the well-stocked lake. I carried my pole, small radio, and my small ice chest. I had an Airedale Terrier named Bully that never left my side, and it was on this day I realized how awesome he really was. Onto the lake we went. Picture a large oval, roughly the size of a football field, but larger, with an L-shaped pier in the southwest corner. Vampire Lane opened up to a more severe decline to the shore, and then the small pier. Across the lake on the west side, there was a narrow tree line that separated the shore from Dogwood Lane. The north side of the lake was the dam, and the south ended in thick and swampy woods. Fortunately for me, I realized later. About 5 minutes after I threw out my line, and 2 touchdowns later, I got that feeling. It's a feeling I've come to recognize well, and it may have saved my life this day. The feeling of being watched by something dangerous. Bully must have felt it too, because a few seconds later, I could hear him growling low and staring across the lake to the west, to the tree line that separated Dogwood Lane from the lake. I turned my head in that direction, and almost immediately, my eyes lit on what I thought to be a half-silhouette of a large man behind a tree. It was too far away to make out details, but close enough to be sure of what I was seeing. Almost 5 minutes went by, and right before I scolded myself for an overactive imagination, the half-silhouette moved behind a tree slowly. Bully stood and growled louder, and I told him quietly to stop. I turned my head north towards the dam while keeping my eyes and attention rooted to that tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while this figure moved slowly from tree to tree, always north and always facing me. The saying, "scared stiff," was something I found to be true in that moment. For some reason, I thought it important that whoever or what it was did not know I was aware. Finally, I realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to the dam, which would make its path to me shorter and easier. My paralysis broke, and I casually put down the fishing pole and started walking towards Vampire Lane. As an adult, I was in the army for 11 years as military police, but not turning to look over my shoulder during that walk was the hardest thing I've ever done. In my mind's eye, whatever it was screaming across the dam towards me. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a run. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me, and my anger turned into admiration as he stopped some 20 yards ahead and faced north until I passed him. He continued this action the entire run home. My dog was watching my back, which is just epic. Although I can grasp the awesomeness of this now, at the time I was so scared that I was literally sick. Even at such a young age, I knew that a large man watching and trying to creep up on a 10-year-old boy was up to no good. When I reached the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got one of my dad's shotguns, as well as his .38 revolver. I sat at the large front window, my eyes glued to both trail openings and the woods between them. My family returned shortly after, and for some reason I didn't mention what happened. I never felt safe there again. When me and my friends or my little sister wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure my parents were with us. What scares me the most, though, is the fact that our closest neighbors were about 2 miles northwest of us, with thick woods in between as the crow flies. Who or what the hell was watching me from the woods that day? I guess I'll never know. I sometimes wish I could go back to then, as a grown man with military training, as I am now. Bully lived a full life and was put to sleep peacefully as a very old but great dog. The best dog I've ever known. Earlier this year I went camping, as I'm wont to do. I chose to head to a campground that I often use because it's not far from where I live. Since I've had kids and I like to reasonably stay close just in case something happens, and also because it's almost always empty. I invited a few friends who were supposed to meet up with me the next day if they could. I arrived at the campground, put $4 in the honor system box, and drove to my usual campsite. I was pleased that I had the place to myself. I first walked over to the pit toilets to make sure they had TP, which they did, and then spent about 5 minutes looking at some of the rock formations near the entrance to the site. When I came back, the parking permit that showed I had paid for my campsite was gone from under my windshield wiper and laid in the grill. I thought it was strange, but figured it was the wind. After all, I hadn't seen any sign of someone else. I left the campsite and hiked about a mile to the small lake where swimming and fishing is allowed. I put a line in the water and walked over to the beach. I started to get the feeling that somebody was watching me, but wrote it off as paranoia. That was until somebody started throwing rocks into the lake. I couldn't see them, and they didn't seem to be aiming at me. But every minute or so, someone would throw a rock, make a splash, and then nothing. No giggling, no screams or ghost noises like I'd expect from a stranger playing a prank. I realized that it was most likely one of my friends who knew I was up there and wanted to have a little fun with me. It's something we do quite often. I immediately hiked back to my van. It was unlocked and would have been too tempting a target to pass up. When I got there, my side door was open. I expected everything to be gone or tampered with, but everything seemed to be in order. I assumed I had startled whoever opened it before they could do anything to my gear. I locked my van and went back to the lake for my fishing pole. The entire time, I was aware that someone was following me, but they never did anything. This let me narrow down my list of suspects to 3 or 4 friends who had the necessary skill to sneak up on me in the woods. I grabbed my pole and headed back, no longer aware of being followed. I assumed my friend got tired of playing with me and would have a surprise for me back at the campsite. I was right. Somebody had drawn a smiley face in the dust where I was going to put up my tent. It was both lame and somehow chilling. I went ahead and set up my tent and got everything ready for the night. At the appropriate time, 2300 I guess, I announced, "Right, I'm off to bed. See you tomorrow," to whoever was in earshot. I bunked down but didn't go to sleep. Sometime later I heard somebody approach my side. I even thought to myself that whoever this was needed to work on stealthy approaches. I heard them shuffling the items I had on the picnic, but couldn't see anyone, because I had put the rain fly up on my tent to discourage a prankster from blasting me with a super soaker or water balloons. Then I heard liquid being poured, and thought to myself, bastards are ruining my coffee. Then I saw a flash, and realized my visitor had used some stone fuel to light a campfire. Since we were under a burn ban at the time, I knew it had to be my friend who works for the National Forest. Nobody else I knew would have done it. We might be assholes to each other, but we're always respectful and law-abiding. I sat up in my tent and said in the most threatening voice I could muster, "Garrow, I love you like a brother, but when I get out of this tent and you don't have a cooler full of beer with you, I'm going to bury this hatchet in your face." There was no answer, just silence. I continued, "Yeah, there might be some remorse, but I'll be over it before your body hits the ground." With that, I opened the tent and glared at the figure in the camp chair across the fire. I was expecting to see my buddy, a tall Native American man. Instead, I saw a thin, pale blonde woman. I choked out, "What?" just as she shot up and ran into the woods. I did what I believe is referred to in the parlance as noped. I broke camp and drove 20 miles away to a different campground. It's weird, but the fact that it was a young woman somehow scared me more than it would have if it had been another guy sitting out there. She could have easily shot me if armed, or even set me on fire if she chose to. When I went home for 3 weeks about a month and a half ago, my dad decided that we should do a bit of night fishing. I'm not a huge fan of fishing, any sort of fishing really, or my dad for that matter. Our personalities are way too similar, and if you leave us together for more than an hour, there may be blood left over by the time he and I are done playing several dozen rounds of fisticuffs, between stubborn arguing and shouting. Anyways, Dad decided to take me to this river up by our new house that they had just finished building. Mom and my brother stayed behind as we traipsed through the dark woods. Now, my family lives in Oregon, and the river was about 1.5 miles in from my family's property, over massive fallen trees and stumps that I easily tripped on, not knowing the lay of the land. My dad merely scoffed at me and reminded me that city living makes you soft, like some stereotypical cowboy out of an Old West film. I blamed the fact that I didn't know the area as well as he did, and it just spiraled downhill from there. Arguing broke out between us, making the peaceful night loud and chaotic. We didn't stop arguing the entire way down to the river, my father critiquing my less-than-Christian lifestyle, while I criticized his manner of parenting my 20-year-old autistic brother. When we got down to the river, we settled into an awkward, tense silence as we got our gear out. I knew that this fight was far from over, as I sat down on a fallen tree stump and shivered my ass off. I had lived in a warm climate for over a year, and honestly, coming out here was probably him punishing me for even leaving the Pacific Northwest. We refused to talk to one another as our lights danced across the water, when my dad suddenly stood up, his light landing on the other side of the river. There on the other bank stood a man looking right at us. He wore a bright orange t-shirt and a pair of scraggly jeans, but for the most part looked pretty average, if you counted the machete hanging from his belt. My dad snapped at me to start packing all our stuff, and so I followed his command. My dad started shouting at the man across the river. Their conversation was mostly lost to the roar of the white-capped water, but I could see the man making agitated sweeps with his hands every time I dared to peek. Their voices grew, and my fear grew with it. My father has never been one to carry protection in the woods, hence why I was born. This man was armed and possibly dangerous with that machete, and while we had the river between us, it was shallow and had plenty of places to cross. Even if it was snow runoff, I had no doubt this man could be behind us in mere minutes. Had he wandered onto this property by mistake and just not known it? Drop the gear, let's go. My dad snarled at me as I took one last look up to see the man starting to walk into the water, his hand flitting against his weapon. My dad put a firm hand on my shoulder and led me back into the woods towards our house. My dad is an ultra-marathoner. He runs like it's going out of style, and my mostly out-of-shape self probably wouldn't have kept up if I hadn't been so terrified. I couldn't hear if the man was coming after us, my heartbeat being so loud in my ears, but I followed my dad so closely I almost ran into him several times. Finally, we found our road and made a break for my parents' house. As soon as we were through the front door, my dad had the doors locked and was keeping a vigilant watch out the windows, making sure no crazy men with machetes were creeping up on our house. Finally, when he figured there were no guys wearing orange t-shirts, we sat down and began to talk about our experience with my mom. We avoided the part where we had been arguing, but told her everything else. We went to bed without apologizing, and I honestly felt pretty horrid. The next day, with only the gun he owned, my father and I walked back out into the woods after calling the police. They said that there was a guy who did enjoy scaring people off forest land in the area, and that we shouldn't be too concerned. Feeling a bit sheepish, we went back to the place where we had left our gear, both of us apologizing for our lackluster behavior the night before. When we returned to what we believed to be the spot, we saw that all our fishing poles had been bent, and the line had been draped from tree to tree. The tackle box was gone. However, me and my dad didn't fight again for the rest of my trip home. So thanks for bringing a temporary truce between me and my dad, crazy man. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments below, as well as perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a personal story that you'd like to submit, or you'd like to just send me a message, links to all of my social media will be in the description for the video below. This includes my Gmail, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the theme of the story is, if it has any, the name of the story, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you're curious at all about the music used in this video, the music is always listed in the description below, in the order which it appears. I also have links to the artists and list the tracks by name, just in case you want to find more of their work. Last but not least, if you have any criticism, please be sure to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.